Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be with you, even if only virtually, for this important gathering. I wish I could be there publicly with you, and I certainly look forward to the very near future when we have the coronavirus behind us and we can get back to normal, whatever normal will turn out to be. But it's a critical period for Taiwan, for the United States, for Japan, and so it's a real honor to address you, even if from far away. And in that regard, I'd really like to thank Susan Chong, the coordinator of the World Taiwanese Congress, Dr. Shu-Min Wu, the coordinator of the Taiwan National Alliance, and Chia-Wan Yao, the senior presidential advisor, a longtime commentator and scholar on the question of Taiwanese independence. You know, coming back to the coronavirus, although this has been a worldwide tragedy, without any doubt, the impact of the disease, as all of us around the world have tried to understand its origins, tried to understand the implications of how the government in Beijing handled the early stages of the outbreak, its efforts through the World Health Organization and elsewhere to write its own narrative of that history and prevent international experts for purposes of public health around the world purely, but to prevent them from fully understanding what had happened, what steps the Chinese had taken to prevent the spread of the disease, all contributed significantly to the tragedy that we've seen over the past 2 years, with an incredible human toll, an economic toll we can't calculate yet, and the disease not yet run its full course. We've had many triumphs in the course of that, certainly the development and production of new vaccines, but the central issue remains that we don't know everything we might have known about the Chinese origin of coronavirus. And I can say in the United States, but I believe it's true elsewhere around the world, that the Chinese effort to censor, to distort, to indulge in propaganda in the face of a worldwide public health crisis has had a very significant impact on public opinion about China in the United States. Surveys here, but in other countries as well, showed that favorability ratings for China had fallen to their lowest level since Tiananmen Square in 1989, and with good reason, because this was not some isolated event. This disease has affected the whole world, and Beijing's approach to it has shown exactly what its motivations are, has revealed the totalitarian nature of the society, has proven the willingness of Beijing to go to practically any length to advance its hegemonic interest around the world. Now, there's a huge debate, of course, over whether this disease resulted in a leak of some kind from the Wuhan research facilities, or whether it developed in a wet market nearby. Scientists and epidemiologists will debate that for some time. I think the evidence is pretty clear what happened here. And since we all know that the epidemiology of a disease like coronavirus can sometimes be very similar to the effects of a biological weapons attack, it's no small matter here that China has gone to such extraordinary lengths to conceal from scientists, from physicians, from epidemiologists who have no political agenda at all, but to prevent them from finding out what actually happened. So one of the consequences here, again, certainly in the United States, but I think in many other countries as well, is that we have a better understanding of what may motivate leadership in Beijing than we've had for quite some time. And in the midst of a lot of other things going on around the world, it has caused people in the United States to ask more questions about China, what it's doing in a variety of other fields, and I think has contributed very significantly to a desire to have a better understanding of the nature of the regime in Beijing and the threats that that regime poses to people all around the world, particularly along China's periphery in the Indo-Pacific, but really on a worldwide basis. So what I'd like to discuss with you this morning are the broad implications of China's place in the world, especially in East Asia, but really globally, because I think that is the venue of the competition and adversarial relationship that we're already seeing, and I think we'll see for the rest of this century, and to try and describe what I think recent events have done to affect that picture, and what our respective policies ought to be over the long term to deal with the Chinese threat, which I think for Taiwan, Japan, and the United States and many others is the existential threat of the 21st century. Now, today, the general situation in the Indo-Pacific region is one where I think nations are increasingly concerned about Chinese activity across a wide variety of fields in the economic space, in political affairs, and military affairs in particular. And I think that this is something that is evolving very rapidly. I think in many respects all of us are coming from behind here and understanding the full spectrum nature of the threat. I do want to get into that in a little bit more detail, but it's to signify that at this point it's not as feasible as we might like to draw grand conclusions from what we see in front of us. Many nations are not willing to assume the broader implications. I can say for our friends in Europe in particular that their trade and other economic relationships with China make it harder for them to appreciate the nature of the threat that I think we see with somewhat greater clarity for those of us that are Pacific Ocean states. But all of this is reflective of a fast-changing environment that really requires extended public debate in all democratic societies, because the nature of this threat is so widespread that some pretty substantial steps are going to have to be taken to preserve our peace and security and our own ways of lives. Let me begin, though, if I might, by trying to assess and explain what's been going on with American policy with respect to China, because I think we are in part prompted by the coronavirus, but really caused by a number of factors. There is a real revolution in thinking about China going on in the United States. It's certainly not complete. Certainly everybody doesn't agree with it. Certainly there are going to be a lot of debates about it. But I don't think you can miss the significance of the intellectual shift that's taking place and the shifts in policy that I think will flow inevitably from it. So this will be brief, I hope you will understand, but to give some sense of it, I did write about this in my memoir of my time as National Security Advisor, because I think it was in the years of the Trump administration when many Americans began the process of waking up to the nature of the threat that many in the Indo-Pacific have seen before us. I would go back to the late 1970s and early 1980s when a couple of significant developments shifted American policy then. The first, what I think was a catastrophic mistake in retrospect, the Carter administration's desire to drop full diplomatic recognition from the Republic of China on Taiwan and grant diplomatic recognition to the People's Republic of China in Beijing. I will come back to how to deal with that toward the close of my remarks. But that action, coupled with the domestic economic reforms that Deng Xiaoping began to make in China were the beginnings of a real change in what America saw in China and what it thought it was trying to do. And particularly Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms, with the prospect of abandoning classic Marxist ideology, adopting more market-oriented policies, showed to everybody that it would be possible to have significant economic growth in China. And that as that economic growth took place and wealth became more widely distributed within the population, that a number of changes would take place in the mainland society that would have great significance internationally. There were two basic premises, or really predictions, that Americans began to make in the mid-1980s and going forward that became foundational elements for American policy: real openness to Beijing, efforts to include it fully in the international community, and those two foundational premises were: one, the idea that economic growth in China and the subsequent accumulation of considerably more wealth would move China in the direction of what you might call the OECD nations, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the world's industrial democracies, or most of them. The feeling was that as China's economic wealth accumulated, as China became more open to foreign trade and investment, as its economic relationships with the rest of the world grew, that this would have a significant impact domestically in China. The view was that Chinese behavior would change, that international norms that were widely accepted in industrial democracies would come into play in China. China would, as it subsequently did, join the World Trade Organization. That, in turn, would have a greater and greater impact on the way China behaved in the world, and that in this extremely important field of international economic relations, China would come to look more and more like the rest of the world. Now, every country is different. Austria is not the same as Japan, and Germany is not the same as the United States, and so there are always variations. But by and large, the theory was that China would as the theory had it, be engaged in a peaceful rise, because you need a peaceful rise to have sustained economic growth, and that China would be a responsible stakeholder in international affairs, all of which would contribute to increased peace and security, greater wealth and trade for everybody affected, and that all of this would continue to grow on basically a straight line. Now, we know that that first foundational premise of policy going back to the mid-1980s has failed, I think, pretty dramatically. China did not become a responsible stakeholder in international affairs. It took its economic policies, which were very far from free market. They were mercantilist policies in the classical sense of that term. They took those policies into the World Trade Organization, and over 20 years, what's happened is that China has come to dominate much of the business of the World Trade Organization. China's behavior wasn't changed. China didn't adopt WTO and industrial democracy norms. China started distorting those norms for its own purpose. There's a huge range of activity that this covers, but the fact was China had its own ideas of what effect economic growth would have on its behavior, and it was quite clearly not to conform to the ideas of the existing large industrial powers, but to bend these powers more into the Chinese mode. So that first foundational premise in the crucible of historic proof turned out to be badly wrong. The second foundational premise also rested on a prediction about the effect of substantial economic growth in China. Advocates of an open American policy to China pointed to history in Europe and elsewhere where increasing society's wealth, the creation of a middle class, in effect, typically accompanied and helped foster increased democracy. And the prediction was that that would happen for China too. And I can very well remember speaking with colleagues during the 1990s who believed in this premise, would say, look, there was an election for headman of a village in some remote province, an election between two communists to be sure, but an actual election. And they said, and we saw another election in another remote village in another province a few months later. And the feeling was that these local, municipal, small town elections would increase. There'd be more competition for elective office. Village by village, town by town, it would spread. Inevitably, at some point after that, elections would be held at the provincial level. And candidates other than Communist Party candidates would emerge. And that these elections would take place and they'd be free and fair, and the example would spread throughout China. And then, in the not too distant future, you'd have national democratic elections in China. And so that in fact, on the political side of things, as in the prediction on the economic side of things, China would come more and more to resemble an OECD-style industrial democracy. Now, we can see clearly today that this second foundational premise also turned out to be catastrophically wrong. The efforts at village democracy did not spread and grow and rise to higher political levels. They've been crushed. Xi Jinping is now the most powerful Chinese ruler since Mao Zedong. Doesn't show any sign whatever of giving up or decentralizing power. In fact, quite the opposite. I think there's pretty broad agreement that even the so-called campaign against corruption was a way for Xi Jinping to go after his political enemies, who I guess all turned out to be more corrupt than his friends, and to use the campaign and many other devices to centralize political and economic power in him and the authorities in Beijing. We can see this played out in many other ways. The crushing of the one country, two systems policy in Hong Kong in plain violation of China's international commitments, its agreement with Great Britain at the time of or leading up to the handover of sovereignty of Hong Kong back to China, dismissed without so much as a backward glance. So I think it's fair to say, roughly 35 to 40 years after these changes in America's perception of China, these foundational premises of our policy, have now been shown to be completely wrong. I mean, completely wrong. And normally when you find the path you've been pursuing is incorrect, the smart thing to do is to change the path. And I do think that that's what the United States is engaged in today, and in terms of its own internal political debate. Not perfectly, to be sure, not completely, and not without some areas that still need considerable attention. But I think we've passed the pivot point, and so the issue is how rapidly we can make a course correction from this long-standing, at least for the United States, it's a long-standing policy of believing in the peaceful rise of this responsible stakeholder in international affairs, which China has not turned out to be. And that's why a big part of what we're doing now, and I think others, especially in Europe, as I mentioned before, still have a long way to go. There are many countries in the Indo-Pacific, Taiwan, Japan, just to name two, but I think others that really have seen much of this in advance and wondered when the United States was finally going to wake up. Winston Churchill had a famous saying. He said, "You can always count on the Americans to do the right thing, usually after they've tried everything else." So we're going through the everything else now, but I do think that in Washington and elsewhere, people do appreciate that the threat that China poses to us in this century is very broad and very substantial, and that it covers the full range of government activity. This makes it different from the Cold War between the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union, where economic interaction was very insignificant, certainly insignificant compared to the relationship between China and the rest of the world today economically. But let me just run through some of the nature of this threat, because I think it's important that we understand the full scope of it, and I think it underlines where there are so many avenues of this threat that it also requires very significant international cooperation among those who seek to defend themselves and their societies from these threats. So let's just start on the economic side. What we've seen from China over this past 35-40 year period of openness on the part of the United States and others, how did China behave in return? Well, perhaps the predominant form of behavior that is threatening to the rest of us is China's systematic theft of intellectual property. It's happened in a lot of different ways. It's covered basically the full scope of intellectual property, from violating patents and copyrights, engaging in forced technology transfers, expropriating business methods, industrial espionage, cheating on agreements involving shared intellectual property, and it's been an incredible multiplier for the Chinese economy. If you don't have to spend money on research and development, if you can just steal it from other countries and their businesses, and then turn around and sell it back to the very countries that you've stolen it from, it gives you a significant economic advantage. And this intellectual property theft has been accompanied by a wide range of other activity, of discrimination against foreign investors and traders in China, distorted financial terms, distorted subsidies that are used in international transactions. In particular, the Belt and Road Initiative, one of China's signature foreign policy programs, is a classic example of this. These are not market-oriented ways of competing with other companies in the global market. These are ways that China used government muscle, often typically behind the scenes, to provide favorable financing and other mechanisms for its domestic concerns, to outdo their competitors in bidding for contracts all around the world. It's really a very multifaceted approach. It's a classic state-directed economy. It obtains both inside China and in the way China behaves globally around the world. And this is something that, as I mentioned, has only grown with Xi Jinping. It's more concentrated now than it ever was before. It's left some countries, for example, we've called it debt diplomacy, the way the Belt and Road Initiative is applied around the world. But it's also a fundamental distortion of what should be free market economics. China had huge advantages it could bring to the market in terms of low wages compared to already industrialized countries, but it wasn't satisfied to compete fairly. It wanted to compete unfairly, and unfortunately, it did quite well. People say, well, why don't we persuade them to give it up? If you have a successful business model, there's got to be a better reason than just saying it's more fair if you do it the right way. China's even gone beyond that. Some of its companies are not industrial firms. They're not companies that compete in the market. They're weapons of the Chinese state. Huawei and ZTE, for example, are not simply telecommunications companies. They're part of an effort by China to take control of fifth-generation telecommunications. We've seen enormous evidence of how Huawei, ZTE, and others have tried to in effect gain control of fifth-generation telecommunications, not just through hardware but through software as well, that would have enabled Beijing to do even more in terms of intellectual piracy, dominance of information technology, its ability to get into the files of companies and governments and your personal computerized files, really all across the globe, and either hack into them and take the information, steal the information, destroy it, distort it, manipulate it, all under the guise of providing low-cost telecommunications around the world. This is an economic challenge, as I say, does not even vaguely compare with Russia, which had a primitive economy right along, notwithstanding its military accomplishments, and very little integrated into Western economies. So this is a big shift dealing with this kind of economic challenge, which the Chinese are using as part of their effort to gain hegemony, first in the Indo-Pacific, but I think more broadly internationally. It goes without saying that they're pursuing a corresponding strategy in the political field. I think most significantly right now we can conclude that China has an entente, to use an old French diplomatic word, with Russia. It may not be a full-up alliance, but I think, for example, in the case of the current war in Ukraine, that China has essentially committed to have Russia's back, to help out its financial institutions that are subject to international sanctions, to purchase Russian oil and gas that it may not be able to sell to previous consumers in international markets, and to render other assistance to Russia as well in the United Nations or in international information wars. And I think that China will expect that Russia would have its back in a future conflict over Taiwan, in the South China Sea, with Vietnam or India, anywhere along the Chinese periphery. We've worried for years about a new growing closeness between Russia and China, and I think it's on the way. It's going to be the reverse of the partnership during the Cold War. China, obviously, very much the senior partner. I think it's going to end up being quite disadvantageous to Russia. And in fact, I've tried to explain this to Russians, and must confess I haven't gotten anywhere. They don't see it as dangerous. I think they'll find out in 50 or 60 years what it may bring to them. But we should not underestimate the impact of this entente and others who are in the orbit to one degree or another. This is going to be an evolving, shifting coalition, I'm sure, and it's not the only. It's certainly not the only initiative that China's undertaken. I think throughout the Pacific Island states, just to name one, the Chinese wolf warrior diplomacy has been quite evident, mistaken in my view, but don't underestimate the efforts that China makes in terms of political influencing. Certainly we see it in the United States. You can see it in countries near China and elsewhere. Very sophisticated. It's not just on Twitter and TikTok and the social media, but in efforts through Confucius Institutes to influence American universities, American newspapers, and indeed when I was in the National Security Advisor job, our feeling was that Chinese influence efforts in the United States were significantly greater than Russia's, although Russia's got most of the attention from the media. But this political push is undeniable. And on the military side of things, I think the evidence is overwhelming. China's engaged in a significant effort to ramp up its military capabilities. It's developing a blue water navy for the first time in 600 years or so. It has one of the world's largest, most advanced cyber warfare programs. It's building up its nuclear capabilities, both in terms of ballistic missile delivery and submarine delivery, hypersonic cruise missiles. You can see it in commercial overhead shots of new construction in remote areas of China. China's been in the forefront of developing anti-satellite technologies designed to blind the United States and our allies capabilities in space in time of crisis or war. China's developing area denial and anti-access weaponry to push the American Navy back from the western shores of the Pacific and other navies as well. Modernizing its conventional forces, and with, I think, clear programs in all three of the weapons of mass destruction: chemical, biological, and nuclear. So these military buildups, which have been extremely costly, are ongoing, and I think they alone disprove the theory this is going to be a peaceful rise. And the real question is when these military threats come to the fore. I think we're very close to that point. Now, I will say in the Trump administration, one of the things that happened was that because of the trade disputes, I do think this was another major factor in getting people to realize the breadth of the threat that China poses for all of us. And the tariffs that Trump imposed on China, for the first time in Beijing's experience, somebody had actually struck back at their economic piracy with real effect. Now, Trump himself wanted the greatest trade deal in history. And if he had won a second term, I think that would have remained his focus. I don't think that his trade policy was strategically vested. I think it was about balance of payments, deficits, and that was pretty much it. And at one point, it did look like the Chinese were negotiating seriously. But of course, at one point during the George W. Bush administration, it looked like the Chinese were negotiating seriously. And it fell apart. And it fell apart in the Trump administration, too. But I think that watching the trade negotiations, but also learning much more about what the Chinese were up to, then compounded by the coronavirus and China's conduct there, were principal factors in adjusting attitudes in America about exactly what China was up to. Now, that brings us to today, really, and I just want to spend a moment before talking about the implications for policy going forward on the situation in Ukraine. Because if I'm correct that there's a Russia-China entente, you can bet that Russia and China are sharing information about what's been happening in Ukraine, and China is watching the reaction of those supporting Ukraine very, very carefully to see what lessons it can learn that it can then apply in the areas of its focus. I might say there's likely a division of labor between Russia and China. Russia has aspirations in Eastern and Central Europe and the Middle East, China in the Indo-Pacific and also in the Middle East, so that their experiences, I think, are going to inform the decision-making of both countries. And I think what we see in Ukraine is, number one, that notwithstanding Western efforts, which proved to be utterly inadequate, Vladimir Putin and his advisors were fully prepared to commit unprovoked aggression, the use of military force to achieve its objectives. Now, I think the Russians badly misjudged both the strength of the Ukrainian resistance and the capabilities of Russian forces. And how this plays out, much remains to be seen. But the willingness to use force, the willingness to continue to use force, even in the face of initial adversity in the first 6 weeks of the war, and the willingness to stand up to Western and global efforts at economic sanctions, I think all are powerful lessons for China. And I'm afraid that Russian failures notwithstanding, and that's the dominant story of the first 6 weeks of the war, the fact is the economic sanctions did not deter Russia from invading to begin with. The economic sanctions have not changed Russia's behavior, at least not to date. And like all targets of sanctions, Russia is doing everything it can to evade the sanctions and mitigate their effects. And I think one conclusion that Beijing would draw from this is that given that Russia is an economy 1/10 the size of China and really a one-trick pony in its export of oil and gas, the West's difficulties in using economic sanctions to prevent Russia from acting, to stop it from acting once it started, to impose unacceptable cost on Russia, have failed to date. And given the much more complex interweaving of the economies of China and other global economies today, I think China draws the lesson that it can be more confident it can withstand economic sanctions because so many in the West are not willing to accept the economic cost that they have to face. In the case of Russia, Germany and many other European countries to this day are still importing Russian oil and gas and still paying Russia in hard currency, helping to finance the ongoing war. But there are many other lessons that I think the conflict in Ukraine will provide to us. So I think it behooves all of us, not just the Chinese, but all of us that are concerned about potential Chinese aggression or Chinese efforts generally to establish its hegemony in what it considers its near abroad, as Russia considers the former constituent parts of the Soviet Union its near abroad, what policies and approaches we might see. So from the U.S. point of view, but I think from the point of view of many others in the Indo-Pacific too, it's important now to take steps that hopefully prevent China from continuing to advance with the rest of us unaware and certainly unable to prevent it from expanding its influence. And I do think there are some hopeful signs. We're going to need a lot more, but I think we've seen the beginning of some steps that can make a big difference. I think these will have significant impacts on Taiwan. You know, American theorists for many years have contrasted East Asia unfavorably with Europe. In Europe, we've had the extraordinarily successful NATO alliance since the late 1940s. Most American scholars and policymakers consider it the most effective political military alliance in history. I think I certainly count myself among them. The web of alliance interaction is dense. Communications are very thick all the time, sometimes too many communications, not enough action. But contrast that with our relationships in East Asia and the Indo-Pacific generally. The alliances are often simply bilateral. There isn't this complex interaction for collective defense that we see in NATO. Now, I'm not talking about establishing a regional United Nations, or even yet certainly not a regional United Nations, which would bind our hands and not produce anything, and not yet a regional NATO. I don't think there are enough countries ready for it. But you don't have to replicate exactly what happened in Europe after 1945 to think about things that can happen today in East and South Asia that can move us toward a position where we're better able together to defend against these aggressive, in some cases outrightly belligerent actions by Beijing. And as I say, I think there are some hopeful signs. We've had the Quad, which actually began in the George W. Bush administration. It didn't go anywhere in the Obama administration. It had some hesitant movement in the Trump administration, I think largely at the impetus of Australia and Japan. But those two countries, plus India, plus the United States, have now met at the head of state level, first virtually and in person for the first time during the Biden administration. Obviously, there's a long way to go here. India, for example, has a very complex relationship with Russia, which with an entente with China, which I think most Indian military officials view China as the main military threat to India, as they should. How that historical complexity works out is still difficult for India. It's difficult when they buy S-400 air defense systems from Russia, can hardly expect for interoperability purposes for the United States to be able to sell large numbers of sophisticated weapons when we're going to be in the presence of a large number of sophisticated Russian weapons. This is something NATO has learned over a long period of time, that how critical interoperability has been. But the very political fact of the Quad, I think is a significant statement. How it develops, whether it takes on other members, I think this is all up in the air. I think we should all give some thought to that. Perhaps at the conference you will have a chance to do it. But I think from the U.S. perspective, I can't underline enough how significant this grouping is and the implications it may have. We've seen other developments too. The AUKUS, Australia, United Kingdom, U.S. Decision to join together to build nuclear-powered submarines for Australia, submarines using U.S. submarine design. I think it's incredibly significant. As the U.S. struggles with its defense budget, which should be a lot higher in my view, here we have this potential for the Australians to take a very significant role in undersea capabilities. And I'm grateful that the Biden administration agreed to it. I'm a little surprised by it, but I think it was the right thing to do. And just recently, we've seen these three countries agree as well to cooperate on hypersonic missile technology, which is another significant step forward in dealing with China. So these are the sorts of things, and we can see these combinations in the economic and political space too. They're not all going to be military by any stretch of the imagination. I think there are alternative ways to get to TPP. Many people blame Trump for not for pulling the U.S. back from TPP. I would just remind everybody that in 2016, Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton said she was against it too. I think the effort to use economic agreements for strategic purposes does make sense. And I think there are a lot of opportunities, especially in discrete agreements that don't cover the full range of economic activity. I think this is something that we should be very creative about, and not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Let's make as much progress as we can. We're going to learn on the fly, and I think we need to be flexible and ready to try different initiatives at different periods of time. So I'd like to see Japan, for example, added to AUKUS. I'd like to take up former Prime Minister Abe's suggestion for nuclear sharing. This is a dramatic step for Japan. I think the nations of Asia should recognize that the debate Japan's had for 30 years about whether it's a normal nation and whether it can participate in its own defense and in collective self-defense is a debate that's now had a conclusion, that Japan is a normal nation. Asia has a lot of history. U.S. has participated in some of it. But I think faced with this common threat to our sovereignty and to our way of life that we see for the rest of the century, we should take heart from Japanese attitude and from the leadership of many in Japan. I think of Prime Minister Abe, Prime Minister Koizumi, who understood the history, but who also understood the present. And so getting Japan to take a larger role there, I think, is going to be very, very significant. I think there are important ways to link up with other defense structures elsewhere in the world. You know, former Spanish Prime Minister Jose Maria Aznar once proposed taking NATO global, adding Japan, Singapore, Australia, Israel, other countries to NATO. I think that's something that we all ought to be thinking about. But my point is here that the prospects, broadly speaking, in Asia are enormously promising, and the more creative we can be, the better. Now, specifically for Taiwan, what are the implications in the international community going forward? I think that Taiwan has a unique opportunity now, given this rapidly growing appreciation of the threats China poses, to play a significant role in the Indo-Pacific world. It's now not an isolated case of Taiwan facing China. It's not something that many countries would say, I wish this would just go away and not bother us anymore. Taiwan is now part of a much wider target population, and that doesn't lessen the threat to Taiwan in any way because of the special claims that Beijing makes against it, but it shows there's now a lot of other interested parties who are receptive to helping Taiwan, and I think that the more who are engaged, the better. I think in Japan, for example, it's now pretty widely understood that an attack on Taiwan is an attack on Japan, and that is the kind of appreciation that we need to come to Taiwan's defense more appropriately, not just from the United States, and I will come to the U.S. here in a minute, but from all the nations of the Indo-Pacific and more broadly. I think Taiwan is uniquely placed to counter Chinese influence, for example, in the Pacific Island states and in the South China Sea, since it has territorial claims in the South China Sea as well as China. There's a lot of work to be done here. Taiwan has for many years had one of the most active international diplomatic programs, despite all of the trouble that it's had dating back to the expulsion of the Republic of China from the United Nations and that Carter administration decision on diplomatic recognition. It's fought a lot of battles on that issue. But I think now, looking at the bigger picture and adding in Taiwan's capacity for global information statecraft, that there are significant opportunities here. Again, I understand it doesn't lessen the threat Taiwan uniquely faces, but I think by continuing in a broader context and including and even increasing that campaign for UN membership in the UN and the specialized agencies all makes sense. And certainly in the U.S., I think we're all willing to do everything we can. Now, to come to my last point here on Taiwan's relationship with the United States, I think, and now many people are saying, it's time to abandon any strategic ambiguity about the relationship between Taiwan and the United States. I think we have the clear basis of an alliance here. It's written into American law. I think we have to begin doing more theory as well as practice in political and military deterrence for Taiwan. We've seen what happened in Ukraine when deterrence failed, perhaps because of the lack of American credibility, perhaps because our threats of future punishment for a Russian invasion were not sufficient to deter Vladimir Putin from deciding to invade. Whatever the reasons, we need deterrence to protect Taiwan that will achieve what deterrence is intended to do, to stop the military attack before it begins. And this is going to take significant increase, I think, in military budgets, both for Taiwan and the United States, but hopefully for many others in the Indo-Pacific as well. It will take even closer coordination between Taiwan and the United States. I think it could and should mean the stationing of American forces on Taiwan, as was once the case before 1979. I think that would be in the interest of both countries. And I think it's critical to signify politically and to facilitate the military steps that the United States grant Taiwan full diplomatic recognition as a truly independent country within every conceivable meaning and customary international law. I recommended this, I'm proud to say, in 2000, 22 years ago, in an op-ed in the Taipei Times dated Thursday, February the 3rd. It was thought to be a pretty extraordinary recommendation then. I didn't think it was terribly extraordinary. I thought it was the right thing to do. I think it's the right thing to do today. Beijing won't be happy with it, but recognizing reality in foreign policy is always an important step. And I think that it would be a signal to everyone else that the reality is that Taiwan is a free and independent state. It's a democratic society with free speech, free markets. It's as contentious as the U.S. and other democratic countries are, but it should achieve U.S. support, and I think in all the ways I've described. So this is a very dangerous moment for all of us, given the aspirations that the leaders in Beijing have, as I've described this, and I'm sure others in the conference will describe as well. But it's also a moment of great opportunity. I think Americans have been friends of Taiwan for a long time. And I think with Japan and others in the region, there's no limit to what we can do. So it's going to require a lot of effort, but I remain confident of the outcome. My best wishes to all of you at the conference, to everyone on Taiwan. I hope to see you all again very soon. And in the meantime, let's stay in touch. Thanks very much.